Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the Mercatus Center for our second day on Procuring Protection, the expense of Homeland Security. My name is Brian Andrew, and I'm pleased that you're going to be able to join us for our talk, What Determines Homeland Security Priorities, focusing on nuclear threats and port security. Our speaker today is Ms. Veronique De Rugy. She is Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. Her research interests are the federal budget, homeland security, tax competition, and financial privacy issues. She's co-author of Action Owl Taxation, a book that was published in Switzerland in 1996. She has a PhD in economics from the Sorbonne in France. Some of her recent publications include Is Port Security Funding Making Us Safer? And Why Washington Was Right to Reduce Its Anti-Terrorism Grant to Los Angeles. You could also please join us on February 12th. We're having a course on the use of internet and online resources to improve government functions. And as always, please don't forget to fill out the surveys in front of you. They're the white forms today, and the comments you make help us to continuously improve the programs we offer you. And if you'd please help me to welcome Ms. De Rugy. I think we're about to get started.
Thank you, Brian. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be talking about allocation of Homeland Security money based on our priorities. And it seems to me that one of our greatest priority should be nuclear threat reduction. By all accounts, the threat of nuclear terrorists bringing a bomb to the U.S. and making it blow up in one of our cities should be one of our priorities. Unfortunately, one of the things that we see is that in spite of a lot of talk about it, there's not actually much done. And especially there's not much done in an effective and efficient way. I started working on these issues because, like always, I would read CQ and I read, it was like 3 years ago, I read that DHS had bought for millions of dollars some radiation portal monitors. And the article went on and on about how these monitors could not, which were supposed to detect highly enriched uranium, and Irving Clark yesterday talked about it, could actually not do that. They wouldn't make the difference between the radiation coming out of bananas or the one coming out of a bomb. More importantly, it would actually show that if the radiation or the source of the radiation was chilled, those monitors couldn't do anything about it. And so I started reading about why we were actually buying so much radiation portal monitor, and that's how I came to get interested in port security. And the reason why I realized we're interested in port security and we're so obsessed about port security is because of that threat of terrorists bringing
Battery probably just died.
Oh, really? Wow. That didn't take long. Oh. It's just, I hope for you that, when I have a microphone like this, my temptation is to start singing. I hope I'm not going to start doing that. Anyway, so we care about port security because of the threat of nuclear terrorism. Terrorists bringing bombs through the U.S. and blowing us up. Not good. And it's true, that port offers a vast opportunity for terrorists to bring something nasty in the U.S. because there's like over 361 seaport. Every year, approximately 9 million cargo containers, that's 26,000 a day, arrive at a U.S. port from all over the world. So experts have said, if a terrorist is going to bring some nuclear material, they'll do it through one of our ports, right? So 3 years ago, I wrote this study on port security. Got no attention at all. I mean, I got my picture in Cargo Magazine International, which, is something, but really didn't get much attention. But then what happened is that there's a Dubai port drama in February of 2006. That happened when the Dubai company wanted to buy the operation of 6 U.S. ports. And because Congress fights yesterday's battles and they just, they get all, worked up about this, then people started talking a lot about nuclear threat. And it was a good thing because we started paying attention to that story. The problem is that, that's how we go back to our topic, is like the way we think about port security and the reason why we think about priority shows, at least in Congress, shows that we have our priority mixed up. In 2007, President Bush requested a budget of $2.3 billion for port security out of a $57 billion government-wide budget for Homeland Security. But the important question, again, is how much money is spent. It's not so much how much money is spent, but rather how is the money allocated. And what I've found when I looked at this issue is that port security allocation decision indicate that spending occurs without, again, much risk analysis, let alone cost-benefit analysis, which leads to a large array of misallocation of spending. For instance, much less money is spent on trying to make sure that terrorists don't put their hands on fissile material than actually trying to make sure that terrorists, when they have the bomb, don't bring it inside the U.S. And I will explain why this is actually really this is really, really problematic. And also, because our port security and our nuclear threat reduction rest mainly on domestic detection of weapons of mass destruction in port, a task that it's not clear could be achieved. The port security model that we have, and in fact, our border security, the border security policy that we have offers almost no value to the nation. And I will argue these points. Remember this, and this is one of the things that my argument rests the most on. Even if we could seal our ports, America would not be entirely safe. The great news is that nuclear threat terrorism is preventable. It is a basic matter of physics. Without nuclear materials, there can be nuclear bomb. What makes a nuclear terrorist is the fact that they own a nuclear bomb. And the only effective way as such to prevent nuclear attacks is to deny terrorists access to weapons of mass destruction. Moreover, there's more great news. Fissile material, which is what you need to make a nuclear bomb, can be kept out of the wrong hands rather easily. The technology for doing so already exists. Russia doesn't lose items from the Kremlin armory, nor does the United States loses supplies from Fort Knox. Well, at least I hope not. So it means that nascent nukes should be kept as secure as the supplies that we secure at Fort Knox. And if they are, terrorists could still attempt to create new supply, but by doing so, it would require a large facility and it would be more visible and we could actually do something about it. So these are like basically the main point I'm going to talk about. I'm going to actually try to walk you through how I came to think about these issues and how I'm an economist. You have to understand this. Like, unlike a lot of security experts who take, a given topic, and just look at it, from within, like how do radiation portal monitor work? I look at the big picture. I'm trying to actually come up with a system to address that problem of nuclear threat, which goes beyond port security. Economists usually think about security policy in terms of trade-off. Basically, we compare cost-benefit analysis. It means that we identify what is our goal, and we identify what are the best ways to allocate money in order to achieve this goal, but also what is the best technique, what is the best choice that we have when they are competing counterterrorism measure to achieve our goal. So there are two types of threats to our port, right? Port as a target, and then port as a conduit, where terrorists would bring money, not money, well, they could bring money too, but would bring a nuclear bomb through the US. So these are like the two reasons why we care about port security. It's true that an attack on our ports direct attack on our port would create some injury, death, and some economic loss. I mean, I've said, ports are like a vital element of our commerce. If they were to be shut down, it would cause a lot of economic loss. The good news is, according to policy expert and security expert, it is actually really, really, really hard to actually shut down, because of a terrorist attack, a port entirely. What is more likely to happen if a port is attacked one way or another is like we're going to actually lose a lot, because the policy in Congress is going to be to shut all the other ports. And that's what's going to actually create the most damage. But the good news here is like, yeah, maybe there are stupid policies that are going to be put in place. But on the other hand, it is very unlikely that a terrorist attack on our port could effectively shut down a port. So that leaves us with the second threat, using port as a conduit to bring in a nuclear device and blowing it up in our ports. The reason why I think, so what do we hear about? We hear about nuclear bomb, dirty bombs, right? We hear about those two things. Well, I would argue that the nuclear one is the only one we should actually really care about. When I was at AEI and when I wrote this study on port security, I actually tried to do a little back of the envelope cost of what it would cost us and the economy. And it's very imperfect measurement, what it would cost us if there were a nuclear bomb detonating in New York or in DC, Chicago, and LA. And what I use is like the Council of Foreign Relations has put out estimate that if terrorists were to use a 1 kiloton nuclear weapon, which is very, very, it's just a very simple, it's not defense grade, kind of weapon, which is what they're most likely able to use. In downtown Manhattan, 200,000 people would die, on the spot, and then probably 200,000 would then be injured, and it would also mean that we would have to probably to destroy and clean up 11 blocks of buildings to clean up and stuff like this. And that doesn't even take under consideration the people who would be irradiated and all that stuff. But anyway, so I used that as a starting point to actually try to measure. So I use the density of population, the cost. I mean, it's imperfect measure, but like the cost of a square foot in each cities. And what I came up with is that a bomb, again, a very imperfect bomb in Manhattan would cost us over $1 trillion, downtown Chicago, over $200 billion, downtown DC, $158 billion, and downtown Los Angeles, over $130 billion. The good news for us in DC is like obviously, so the way also I measured this cost is economists actually, there's a very large literature of how you measure the value of lives lost. And that's actually what the real cost is. And economists usually say for one person who dies, the cost is $5 million of expected cost. Of course, I mean, it's a very, again, imprecise measure. So what it means, what these number means, is that basically in DC, much fewer people would die because the density of the population is like, that's good news for us. So, because I see you with your face like, but anyway, so, I mean, extremely expensive, right? Why shouldn't we worry about a dirty bomb? I know that a dirty bomb is a much more likely event than a nuclear threat, but the thing that people don't quite understand about dirty bombs is that they're just regular bombs. They don't do much more damage than, a regular bomb. They do too much damage, of course, but they don't do that much damage. The real cost of a dirty bomb is the cleanup that you have to do. So if there's a dirty bomb that goes off in New York, it will kill very few people, not that many people as with a nuclear bomb, but what you will have to do, you will have to tear down buildings. And that's where the expenses are. But as a consequence, the cost of an event like this is much lower. Remember, the cost of a nuclear bomb blowing up in lower Manhattan is over $1 trillion. The cost of a dirty bomb in New York City is $95 billion. And the cost, and there was also, I'd also done, the cost of a nuclear attack on a New York port is $10 billion. So that actually, I understand a lot of people are annoyed at economists because we always try to put a price tag on the value of life and stuff like this. But that actually kind of helps us, if you do it properly, assess what our priorities are. And nuclear bomb in New York City, killing a huge amount of people, over $1 trillion loss. Dirty bomb, much less than $100 billion. And then an attack on one of our ports, $10 billion. It's not that it's $10 billion is not much, but it just should help us assess what our priorities are. And again, so I think, to me, there's absolutely no doubt that our priority should be to actually prevent terrorists from ever using a nuclear weapon in the US, because that would be devastating. Do I understand that the probability of such an event is very low? Yesterday we've had very heated debate about, probability, terrorism probability, the likelihood of an American dying of a terrorist event being much, 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 much smaller than being killed by an asteroid or whatever falling on us. Yes, I do understand it. However, I think that considering the catastrophic consequences of such an event happening, we should, in fact, make it our priority. There's something that we need to understand. And here's the problem. A lot of the focus today of our Homeland Security in preventing a nuclear threat rests on this concept of port security, because experts say that the probability of terrorists it's a very high probability that if terrorists bring some sort of nuclear device, they will bring it through our ports. So this is why I actually link those two things. And this is, to me, the biggest mistake that we make. One of the things we need to understand, and this is where being French is actually very relevant, even though I have actually a funny story to tell you. I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal when the Dubai port scandal was happening, saying we shouldn't care, let them buy things because what matters is like protecting fissile material. And I got I got a lot of email telling me I was an idiot, that I was horrible. But the funniest one I got was a guy who said, well, the day we give the French, we make the French responsible for our homeland security, then we can turn our port to the Arabs. I thought that was pretty funny. Anyway, being French, though, is pretty interesting in this case because I can bring some historical perspective. What is the problem with port? Securing port, sealing our ports, making sure the terrorists are not going to get through. The problem is that ports are stationary targets. What does that mean? Remember the Maginot Line? Do you remember what the French did when they were trying to prevent the German to get into France? They built this incredible line that no one could get through. And they were right. This was like a great system. They effectively sealed France. So what did the Germans do? They got bicycles and they went around. It took them a while because it was a pretty big, but they went around. They went around it. And so the problem with our ports, when you focus exclusively on sealing our ports and making sure that nothing goes through our port, is that you have a stationary target and your enemy can decide to go and attack somewhere else, which they usually do. As a consequence, knowing this, I will argue that our priorities and the way we should design our nuclear threat reduction policy should rest on 3 priorities. And the first one, we should allocate, and that's not I've actually talked to a lot of security experts who know much more about this stuff than I do. They argue that probably 70% of the resources that we allocate should go there. This is a pretty big priority. We should try to make sure to stop terrorists from acquiring the bomb. Because again, trying to think of how do we, when I talk with people on the Hill, the question I get a lot is, how do we make sure that terrorists don't bring bomb through our ports? Wrong question. The question that we need to ask, again, I can't repeat it enough, is how do we make sure that terrorists and Al-Qaeda doesn't become a nuclear power? That's the question. And that, from there, you derive our first priority. We want to stop terrorists from acquiring the fissile material necessary to build the bomb. That's where we should spend the most money. As we've said before, no fissile material, no bomb. We can achieve this by keeping close tabs on fissile material around the world, which, by the way, is easier than actually try to track down a piece of it anywhere in the world, right? The other thing we can do, we can try to buying foreign stockpiles and helping foreign government protecting and destroy their stockpile. That's our first priority. It's much more complicated, of course, than just those three little policy recommendations. And there are people who are actually expert and who actually devote all of their time and resources to actually think about these questions. And I think of a group in particular that I think has done a very decent job at answering questions like this, and it's called the Nuclear Threat Initiative. You can find, and they actually put out a DVD that's pretty scary. It's called Our Last Best Chance or something like this, with Fred Thompson. So anyone, so anyway, I would recommend, it's like, I'm not going to give you all the details because, again, I'm an economist. I'm not a security expert. There are people who are have way more expertise in how to achieve those priority and those policy that I talk about. Not that I don't have some idea. The second priority that we should have is, in case of terrorists, if we failed that, in case terrorists, in fact, manage to steal some fissile material, then we should spend some resources recovering nuclear material and device if they fall in the hand of terrorists. For instance, the US should lead an international effort with cooperation from abroad in tightening security at foreign ports. The effort should assist in funding system to bolster security detection ability in foreign countries or place US agent on site in foreign ports. We could have partnership, or we can take over, whatever. But anyway, we should spend, some resources at all time, probably 20% of all the resources that we spend in trying to recover the material and make sure that if terrorists acquire it, it actually doesn't get to a US port. The third one is to invest in response and mitigation capability. So it means that if case of an event, in case of a terrorist attack, we need to have in place a response mechanism so we can clean up the mess and try to save life by responding effectively to the attack. And and we should, there are different ways to think about it. We could have a system where, region in the US, each region in the US have a system to respond, or we could have a one national system. There's a lot of debate about what system would be better. For an attack on a port, we should have plans to evacuate civilian and personnel, placing emergency equipment within easy reach, training first response and medical personnel to handle emergency and attack, and developing business continuity strategy to allow the port to get up and running quickly after an attack. That is actually, the continuity plan is actually an important element of preparing ourselves in the case of an event like this. Think about 9/11. One of the things that was absolutely amazing, the two Twin Towers collapse. A lot of insurance company, trading company, they just lose their headquarters. 5 days after, they're back up and running somewhere else. This is amazing. And it is because for pretty much every big firm, they have continuity planned. A plan that what happens if your entire internet system collapses? What do you do? Well, our security should rest on things like this, and we should do it at the city level. So we have 70%, 20%. I would allocate roughly 10% of the money that we spent on this event. Finally, bear with me. One thing that I would like you to think about, because this is something that we actually spend a lot of money on. Economists usually think that because of the port being a stationary target, that direct prevention on site on things like radiation portal monitor and things like this, or surveillance equipment, access control system for employee and visitor, is not cost effective. You know, direct defenses are only as good as our weakest link. What it means, again, is like you have a system, and terrorists are not stupid. You know, they're not robots. They actually will say, look, we were going after New York. New York's pretty well protected. Well, we'll go where the protection is weak. So what it means is that if you actually going to invest all of your money in actually direct prevention in our ports, you better be sure that you are actually ready equally everywhere. That's not possible. And as such, it really means that direct protection, direct prevention is our least cost-effective way to protect us against nuclear threat. So what are we doing? Knowing that, plus think about the war on drug. I mean, like our war on drug rests a lot on trying to prevent things from entering. I would argue that we've been losing that war, pretty much, because it is really, really hard to prevent terrorists from entering. Plus, think about it this way. You know, if the ports are sealed, you know, they're going to fly a plane. They're going to, I mean, there are millions of miles that are unprotected. So what are we doing? So you remember our priority, preventing terrorists from acquiring the bomb, the fissile material, then recovering it, and then mitigating in case of an attack. I'm going to try to look at what we're doing today to actually prevent a nuclear threat from happening in the US. And again, you know, a lot of that prevention rests on our port security spending. What we see, the $2.3 billion that we spend are mainly spent or entirely spent actually on our second priority. What we do, the system is designed to actually try to make sure that a bomb, you know, doesn't go through our borders or are not loaded in a foreign port or en route to the US. So how do we do? We have the Container Security Initiative, which target high-risk containers for inspection at overseas ports prior to their departure to the US. Today, it deploys team of inspectors, special agents, and intelligence analysis in 43 foreign ports to inspect cargo container for weapon of mass destruction before being shipped to the US. In 2007, CSI had a budget of $139 million, which is, you know, it's pretty small, you know. And also, again, here's the problem here. We have 53 ports that are actually on board with us to actually help us try to prevent bombs from being loaded in a cargo en route to the US. Well, terrorists are thinking creatures, but then they're going to probably try to go on a port that doesn't have one of this system in place. In addition, DHS spent $60 million on custom and trade partnership against terrorism. Basically, it's 7,000 businesses. That's the number. It was like in November. That's the number that we have. 7,000 businesses, including most of the largest U.S. importer, involved in its public, private, and international partnership. And the idea here is, if a bomb if CSI does its job properly, how do we guarantee that the bomb is not loaded when it's en route to the US? And the idea is, like, we assume that we have trusted partner, like people who we trust to actually put in place a chain of command that would actually guarantee that type of thing. And these partners that we have, we don't need to actually pay as much attention to them because they're a trusted partner. And it's a system that makes sense, but we invest $60 million on it. The most money that we spent is for the Nuclear Domestic Detection Office, which gets close to $600 million to actually put in place those those radiation portal monitors, which it's been highly documented. Basically, DNDO's job is mainly geared at detection in our ports, which, if you followed what I said before, it should kind of be pretty low on the priority food chain. So CSI seems important. The partnership, making sure that things are not loaded on board, pretty important. Well, we're spending less than $200 million on that. However, protection in our ports is getting close to $600 million, and also investing a lot of money on radiation portal monitors that are not working. For those of you who were there yesterday, Clark Irvin was talking about the fact that now DHS had this plan to buy, a new technology, because there was, so as I said, there were just a lot of, it was clear that the radiation portal monitors that we had invested in before were just not working. There was a problem that they couldn't detect highly enriched uranium, that if a bomb or the fissile material was shielded, it couldn't detect it. But it also had the problem that it was actually sending a lot of false alarm. So what it meant is, like, each time you have an alarm, you have to have the cargo inspected. That takes a long time. Then it adds, there's a long queue. And that has a massive cost, right? So there were a huge amount of false alarm. So DHS says, well, we're going to invest in much more expensive and better technology. And turned out that after talking about investing $1.2 billion, this technology, one radiation portal monitor is $400,000. So that's just a lot of money if you want really to protect all of our ports and port of entry. It's actually not working. And here's the thing that I think, and it's just like it shows that it actually doesn't work at 50% of the time. It gets a lot of false alarm and things like this. So on top of that, we just don't really have the technology. But here's one of the questions that I have. A year and a half ago, I was on a conference call with Chertoff when he was actually talking about this investment. And I remember that I had read a GAO, and you guys who know, how the Hill works, GAO had actually put out a report putting out questions about those new radiation portal monitor. And I remember bringing it up to Secretary Chertoff and saying, I read this, and he was like, yeah, nonsense. I don't think it's a problem. And now we learned this week that in fact GAO was right, and not that GAO is always right, but that GAO is right. And I'm actually wondering if you guys could actually explain to me, how does that happen? Why is it that GAO a year and a half ago was saying things like this, they were ignored, and a year later or a year and a half later, turned out they were right? It seemed that we've spent, a lot of time and money and effort, just investing in something that we should have known from the beginning that we need to be suspicious about. So again, when you look at the way we spend our money on port security, our priorities are not right. More importantly, if you look at the way we actually also, how much money is actually spent on keeping nuclear weapons and weapon usable and nuclear material out of terrorist hands, you're just like astonished, because $2.3 billion spent directly in our port trying to prevent terrorists from bringing it in, but preventing terrorists from actually acquiring fissile material is $1.1 billion. And if Congress adopt, the omnibus bill was just spent, so I actually don't know exactly how the money was in fact allocated. But if Congress has adopted the Administration 08 proposal in its entirety, the nuclear threat reduction resources available would decline by almost $1 billion. So I'm just, from the previous year. So it's just kind of like, I'm quite amazed, especially considering how much talk, a lot of people talk about nuclear threat as our priority, and yet we don't seem to be spending that much resources on actually trying to prevent terrorists for becoming nuclear terrorists. Activities in this program, in the $1.1 billion, most of them are spent through the Department of Defense and Energy. They include securing and accounting for nuclear material, helping states intercept nuclear smugglers at their borders, and getting rid of vulnerable caches of bomb material. But the numbers here, again, can be misleading, because the biggest share of our efforts support activities in the U.S. to eliminate our own highly enriched uranium and plutonium rather than securing Russia's vast stockpile of nuclear weapons, which clearly limits the effectiveness of this strategy. So again, when we think of priority and how we should be, we should be allocating our money, it seems that here again we do things exactly the other way around. We should be spending a lot of money on this. We should be spending a lot of money. And a lot of it is also not necessarily money. We should actually spend a lot of effort, diplomatic effort, to actually try to make sure that Russia's on board and a lot of other countries that have stockpile of fissile material are on board with us to actually achieve that goal. And yet, we really don't do that. But we spend $2.3 billion on trying to prevent terrorists from actually bringing it in. And even within that goal, that goal of if they have fissile material, within that actually objective, their priorities are wrong because we invest everything in our ports. So it just basically, we have our priority just all messed up. In Washington, priorities are measured by how much lawmakers are willing to spend on a mission relative to another. So I guess we can conclude that ensuring that terrorists don't acquire nuclear weapons or material isn't a high priority, in spite of the talks. People will tell you it is a priority, but in fact, when you look at the number, it's not. Experts have repeatedly noted that this mission suffers from fundamental defects, which I think I've exposed here, and I'm sure there's much, much more criticism that can be expressed, and is in dire need of resources. And I will say, that in spite of my criticism of government, which is pretty much constant, this is like an area where I think we should, in fact, expend vast amount of resources. And we're not. No resources have been made available to address this problem. One of the information that I found was the scariest is that when you look at the amount we spent on actually trying to prevent terrorists from acquiring fissile material since 9/11, it's flat. We haven't directed more resources to that goal than we used before 9/11. And I find that really scary. More telling is the fact that 1.1 billion, this 1.1 billion that we spend on denying terrorists access to nuclear weapon and material, pales in comparison to the amounts we spend each year on much less catastrophic threat. And I will argue that the airline security is a good example. After 9/11, we've put in place cockpit doors that actually prevents another 9/11 type of attack. There are other threats to airline securities, but this one cannot happen anymore. And yet, we are spending close to $6 billion every year on that threat. Well, this is a lot of money compared to the $1.1 billion. We've spent over $3 billion to help state and local government build up their response capacity. Again, I think it is important to build response capacity in the states. I would argue that most of that burden should be taken on by the states rather than the federal government, but I think it was important for the federal government to actually jumpstart the process and start building it. And it's important because, as I said, this is my third priority, right? It's like cleaning up the mess after it happens is important because it saves life. Well, we spend $3 billion a year, which is like much, much more than we spend on actually trying to make sure terrorists don't acquire fissile material. In the end, much of the money spent on port security goes to lower priority programs. And I think this is actually a really good example of what's happening when we think of Homeland Security and our priority. I guess the answer is probably because maybe it's not politically, it doesn't sell really well to actually said we're going to actually be spending money in those land far, far away, rather than say, hey, look at those big radiation portal monitor. They're very visible. You can point at them. You can say, maybe that's the reason why we're doing this. Or maybe it is because people don't realize. Maybe it is also because, the public doesn't have an understanding of what's going on. It's just this $1.1 billion that I mentioned, it took me a year and a half to actually come up with, because even the people who were really obsessed with nuclear threat reduction are actually never put the number together. And one of the problems also that we suffer from is like there's not a nuclear czar in Congress. There's not someone who's actually the person responsible for achieving that goal. So it seems to me that we're not spending money on the right priorities. And I do hope that we're not going to need, because as I said, I think Congress fights yesterday's battles. Mainly that's how people react, that we don't need to have 200,000 people die to make it become our priority. Thank you. So if you want to ask me a question or actually teach me things, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. As usual, we will make sure that the videos are online by next week so you can see both this presentation and yesterday's presentation. Please don't forget to fill out the surveys before you leave. And also, if you will wait for the microphone, we are recording so we can have the best recording online. Yes, we'll wait for her to get plugged in. But are there any questions?
You were saying that we don't have the technology working to be able to determine radiation between bombs and bananas. Does anyone have that technology currently in their ports that we should be looking to them?
I don't think so. I think we have. We have some technology that actually could, under some circumstances, identify the right thing when we need it. The problem is, I think one of the big technological problems that we have is like if highly enriched uranium is actually shielded, you actually can't see it. You can't detect it. I don't know that anyone has it and that we could be buying it somewhere. It's interesting, like when I give talks about like cutting federal spending, I always get like tons of questions, but when I say we don't spend enough, I don't have any questions. Did I completely convince you? You don't have any questions?
Well, seeing no questions, please help me in thanking her, and all of you have a great day.